Hi, welcome back. I was reaching behind my media console yesterday to plug in a new HDMI cable, and I accidentally brushed my forearm against the back plastic of an 85-in mini LED I've been testing right near the top exhaust vents. It was radiating heat like a space heater, not just warm from being on, actively hot to the touch, and it kind of hit me right then. We're looking at this entire 10-year TV decision completely backwards. Hi, this is NextGen Picks. If you're trying to decide between something like the LG C5 and the TCL QM8, the high-end OLED versus the retina-searing bright mini LED, you're probably worried about one thing: OLED burn-in, right? That's the story we've all been fed. OLED is the fragile glass slipper. Meanwhile, these massive 5,000 nit LED TVs are supposed to be indestructible tanks that'll survive a decade of daily abuse in your living room. But here's the part nobody talks about. When you actually put your hand behind one of these ultra-bright LCD TVs after a 2-hour HDR movie and feel that heat pouring out, you start to realize something the spec sheet conveniently ignores. Driving that much brightness through an LCD panel requires serious voltage, and that heat has to go somewhere. You're essentially cooking the internal power supply and stressing the motherboard every time you crank up daytime sports in a bright room. Before we dig into firmware logs, sustained brightness limits, and the actual thermal ceilings of these two TVs, if you value testing that isn't sponsored or filtered by a brand's PR team, hit that like button and subscribe to NextGen Picks. It's the only way we keep these deep dives completely independent. So let's break down this whole 10-year lifespan myth. For the longest time, the industry told us that if you buy an OLED, you're buying a ticking bomb of burn-in. And if you buy an LCD or mini LED like the TCL QM8, you're making the safe long-term investment. I believe that too. 5 years ago, it was mostly true. But look at the TCL QM8. When you actually try to wall mount this thing, it is shockingly heavy. We are talking almost 50 lb for the 65-in model. And that weight isn't just premium chassis materials. It's thermal mass. It's literal sheets of metal heat sinks inside the TV. Because to hit 5,000 nits of peak HDR brightness, which is completely blinding if you're watching a movie in a dark room, you have to push an insane amount of voltage through the back of the display. And here is the reality of electronics that nobody talks about on the Best Buy showroom floor. Heat degrades silicon. It bakes capacitors. If you leave this TV running in a bright living room, fighting the afternoon sun for 5 hours a day, the LEDs themselves might not die, but the power delivery board is taking an absolute beating. That's usually what kills an LED TV at year 4 or 5, not the screen itself. The board fries. Don't get me wrong, the QM8 looks incredible in the right room. If you have skylights or massive floor-to-ceiling windows, an OLED is going to look like a dark mirror. You need this kind of brute force. And TCL gives you thousands of local dimming zones to keep the black levels looking surprisingly deep. But it comes with quirks. Actually, have you ever watched a soccer match and noticed faint, dusty-looking vertical bands across the grass when the camera pans quickly? That's called dirty screen effect, DSE. It's a massive issue with these high-zone mini LEDs. It's a total panel lottery. You might get a flawlessly clean one, or you might be unboxing and reboxing an 85-in monster twice in a week, trying to get a good panel. That is a miserable weekend. Plus, to make their black levels look as good as an OLED, TCL uses a really aggressive local dimming algorithm. They just shut the backlight zones completely off in dark areas. So yeah, the letterbox bars on a movie look pitch black. But if you're watching a dark scene like The Batman or an episode of House of the Dragon, you lose half the detail in the shadows. It's called Black Crush. You buy a 5,000 nit TV and suddenly you can't see the texture of a dark suit in a dimly lit room. And then there's the software. It runs Google TV, which is usually great, but on this specific hardware, the menus can randomly lag. Sometimes you hit the volume button and the visual bar just stays frozen on the screen for 3 seconds, or the EER cord decides to drop audio to your soundbar until you unplug the whole thing from the wall. It's the small daily frictions that wear you down over time. Actually, while we're talking about unboxing nightmares and software glitches, let me know in the comments what specific TVs or soundbars you guys are agonizing over right now. I read literally every comment to figure out what hardware to buy for the test bench next month. So, tell me what you're stuck on. If playing the panel lottery and dealing with all that heat feels like a bad bet, this next one is where the math starts to look entirely different. But you have to let go of some old fears to get there. The LG C5. I know what you're thinking. Next-gen picks. OLEDs burn in. Look, if you leave CNN running 10 hours a day every day with that static red banner at the bottom, yes, do not buy an OLED. But for 95% of us, the C5 is ironically the safer 10-year bet, which sounds crazy, I know. Let me explain what's actually happening inside the panel. LG completely changed the chemistry of these screens a few years ago. The C5 uses an EVO panel that incorporates deuterium, heavy hydrogen, which handles heat vastly better than older OLEDs. But the real secret is the invisible babysitting. When you turn off the C5 with the remote, it doesn't actually turn off. Not right away. It drops into a low power state and quietly measures the electrical resistance of all 8.3 million individual pixels. It finds the ones that were working the hardest during your gaming session, and it microscopically adjusts the voltage to even out the wear. About 10 minutes later, you'll hear a faint little click from the back of the TV. That's the internal relay finally shutting off. It literally takes care of itself. Even just setting it up, you immediately notice the difference in engineering philosophy. When you lift the C5 out of the box, the top half of the screen is thinner than your smartphone. It feels terrifying to hold. You're constantly worried you're going to snap the glass if you pinch it too hard while lifting it onto the media console. Contrast that with the TCL, which feels like you're lifting an engine block. Precision versus brute force. With the C5, you get perfect pixel-level contrast. Zero blooming around white subtitles, and 4 full bandwidth HDMI 2.1 ports that make it flawlessly responsive if you're hooking up a PS5 or a high-end PC. But there is a catch. There is always a catch. Because OLEDs are so deeply paranoid about heat and burn-in, the TV actively fights you if you push it too hard. It's called the Auto Brightness Limiter, the ABL. Picture this. You're playing a game, and your character walks out of a dark cave into a massive, bright, snow-covered landscape. Initially, it looks stunning, punchy, and brilliant. But if you stand in that bright, snowy area for 60 seconds, you will literally watch the TV dim the entire screen. The processor realizes, hey, too much of the screen is drawing maximum power. The thermal load is spiking. We need to cool down. And it just pulls the plug on the brightness. If you watch a lot of daytime hockey, the ice turns from pure white to kind of a dull grayish tone by the second period. It is incredibly jarring, if you aren't expecting it. And there's one more physical reality of the C5 you have to accept. The screen is glossy. LG claims the C5 is bright room ready, but let me be clear, that is mostly marketing. It handles direct glare a bit better than the old C3, but if you put this TV opposite an open window on a sunny afternoon, you aren't going to see the infinite black levels of the OLED. You are going to see a perfect 4K reflection of your living room couch. So you have this strange trade-off. The QM8 gives you relentless sun-beating brightness, but it runs hot enough to potentially shorten its own motherboard's life. The C5 gives you flawless contrast, incredible gaming response, and surprisingly good panel longevity, but it constantly throttles itself to survive. So if you're sitting there thinking, well, neither of those sounds exactly perfect. One cooks its own motherboard to give you daylight brightness, and the other actively dims your screen just when the game gets good. What else is there? If you still want OLED contrast, but you want more color punch than the C5, you are probably looking at Samsung, specifically the QD-OLEDs like the S90D or the newer S90 series. I set up the Samsung S90 right next to the C5 last month, and honestly, getting it out of the box was terrifying. The panel is so absurdly thin at the top, it literally flexes if you breathe on it wrong. But when you turn it on, the colors are genuinely incredible, because Samsung uses quantum dots instead of the white subpixel that LG uses. The reds and greens in bright HDR scenes just explode off the screen. But here is where things get weird. If you are putting this TV in a normal living room, meaning you have a lamp on or sunlight coming through the blinds, you are going to notice something frustrating. The S90 lacks a polarizing filter, which sounds like a boring spec sheet detail until you actually sit down to watch a movie during the day. Because of the way the quantum dot layer reacts to ambient light, the screen doesn't stay perfectly black when light hits it. It actually raises the black levels. So, the letterbox bars on a widescreen movie, they don't look pitch black anymore. They look dark gray or even a little purple. I was watching a space scene in Interstellar with the overhead lights on, and the deep black of space literally had a magenta tint to it. You turn off the lights and it goes back to perfect black. But who watches TV in a pitch black room 100% of the time? Wait, actually, I need to mention the software too, because this is a huge part of the ownership reality. Samsung runs Tizen OS, and I don't know who designed the current layout, but it is deeply annoying to use. I was trying to navigate the settings menu to turn off their motion smoothing, because by default it makes every movie look like a cheap daytime soap opera, and it took me 7 clicks. 7 clicks through menus that constantly stuttered just to turn off a feature that shouldn't be on in the first place. You interact with that menu every single day over a 10-year lifespan. That kind of daily friction will make you hate the TV, no matter how good the colors are. So, if you don't want to deal with Samsung's purple blacks, you don't want LG's auto dimming, and you don't want to play the panel lottery with the TCL QM8, you just want a mini LED TV built like a tank that will actually last a decade, that brings us to the Sony Bravia 9. I didn't think this TV would matter to most people because of the price. It is brutally expensive. You are paying a massive Sony tax, but I almost ignored it. And that would have been a mistake because the engineering here is totally different from the rest of the market. When you buy an 85 in Bravia 9, you immediately realize what you paid for the second the delivery guys drop it off. The thing weighs over $100 lb without the stand. It is incredibly thick. You literally need heavy-duty lag bolts if you plan on putting it on a wall mount, because standard drywall anchors will absolutely rip out. But that thickness, that weight, that is the thermal management. Unlike the TCL that just brute forces its brightness and runs hot, Sony uses an algorithm called XR Backlight Master Drive. Instead of just blasting the LEDs, it uses an incredibly sophisticated chip to gently roll the power to the local dimming zones. It controls the voltage on a microscopic level. I was running a thermal camera over the back of the Bravia 9 after a 3-hour gaming session, and it was barely warm. That is how you build a 10-year panel. You manage the heat, and the blooming control is insane. You know how when you watch a dark movie with subtitles, there's usually a glowing white halo around the text on an LED TV. Sony's processor is so fast, and the dimming control is so precise that the blooming is practically invisible. It's the closest an LCD has ever gotten to looking like an OLED, plus the remote control. I know it sounds like a small thing, but Sony gives you a heavy backlit premium metal remote. It feels like an actual piece of high-end home theater gear, unlike the cheap plastic wands everyone else throws in the box. And the Google TV integration on the Sony is inexplicably smoother than on the TCL. I don't know if they're using more RAM or just a better SoC, but the menu lag is gone. The limitation with the Sony is strictly financial. You are paying thousands of dollars more just for that processing and build quality. And honestly, it still doesn't have the instantaneous pixel response time of an OLED for hardcore competitive gaming. Look, this is where the industry tries to confuse you. They throw out terms like QLED, Neo QLE, QD-OLED. It is all designed to obscure the physical reality of what you are buying. Every single one of these displays has a fatal flaw. The Samsung raises its blacks in a lit room. The LG constantly dims itself to survive. The TCL cooks its own power supply and crushes shadow detail. The Sony requires a second mortgage and weighs as much as a small refrigerator. You just have to pick which flaw you can actually live with. So, where does that actually leave us? If every TV has a compromise, how do you avoid dropping $2,000 on a mistake that you'll be staring at for the next decade? Actually, I want to group these based on what your house actually looks like because that is the only metric that matters, not the spec sheet, the room. If you're putting this TV in a living room that essentially functions as a greenhouse, you have massive skylights, you leave the blinds open all weekend, and you mostly just want to watch football with the guys on a Sunday afternoon, you do not want an OLED. You want the TCL QM8. Yes, it runs hot. Yes, you might have to box it back up and exchange it if you get a panel with terrible dirty screen effect. Hauling a 75-inch box back to Best Buy is a nightmare, I know. I've done it. But if you get a clean panel, the sheer brute force brightness of this thing is unbeatable for the money. It will cut through direct afternoon sunlight like it isn't even there. For that specific bright room buyer, the QM8 is the best value on the market right now. You are getting 90% of the visual punch of a flagship TV for almost half the price. Just don't mount it flush against the wall. Leave it on the stand or put it on an articulating mount so the back vents can actually breathe. If you trap that much heat against drywall, you are just asking for the power board to cook itself by year 4. Wait, let me backtrack slightly. If you have a bright room, but you absolutely cannot stand the idea of dealing with TCL's menu lag, and you have the budget to essentially buy your way out of the problem, that is where the Sony Bravia 9 comes in. The Sony is for the person who wants to buy a TV today, mount it using industrial lag bolts because the thing weighs as much as a small car, and literally never think about it again for the next 10 years. It handles motion perfectly. It upscales terrible 720p cable box signals, so they actually look decent. The thermal management is incredible, but you are paying a massive premium just for that peace of mind. Now, what if you don't have a greenhouse for a living room? What if you have normal lighting, maybe a couple of lamps at night, blinds you can pull shut during the day, you play PlayStation 5, you watch 4K movies on Netflix, and you just want the most cinematic, flawless image you can get without taking out a loan? For that buyer, which realistically is most of us, the LG C5 is the best overall TV. And I say that knowing exactly how annoying the auto brightness limiter can be. I was playing a game the other night, and the screen just inexplicably dimmed because I spent too much time looking at a bright skybox. It's frustrating. But when you weigh that against the total package, the C5 gives you absolutely perfect inky blacks, zero blooming around subtitles, 4 HDMI 2.1 ports that work flawlessly without hand-shaking errors, and a processor that handles motion with incredibly clean precision. And as far as the 10-year panel goes, I actually trust the C5 more than the budget mini LEDs. I know that goes against everything the internet tells you, but LG's thermal design combined with that invisible background pixel cleaning cycle works. You just have to treat it like a normal TV. Don't leave a static news ticker running on maximum brightness for 12 hours a day, and the screen will easily outlast the processors in most LED TVs. Look, here is the truth bomb that the TV industry really doesn't want you to figure out. The perfect TV doesn't exist because the perfect TV would have to defy the laws of physics. You can't have 5,000 nits of blinding daylight brightness without generating electronics killing heat. And you can't have perfectly cool, self-lit organic pixels without some risk of burn-in or brightness throttling. Every manufacturer is just choosing which law of physics they want to fight and passing the consequences down to you. The marketing departments will try to convince you that their new processor or their new panel coating have solved these problems. They haven't. They've just hidden them in the fine print. So your job isn't to find the perfect TV. Your job is to look at your living room, look at your habits, and decide which imperfection you can easily live with. I actually keep a running updated list of the specific TV models and exact revision numbers that pass my thermal and longevity tests because these companies quietly change parts mid-year all the time. I'll drop the links to those vetted models in the description below. If you use those links, it guarantees you are getting the safe versions, not the warehouse leftovers with the older, hotter power supplies. It also helps support the channel so I can keep buying these things and ripping them apart. Let me know down in the comments which compromise you decided to live with. I read all of them. Until next time, this is NextGen Picks. Keep your receipts and don't trust the box. See you guys.